As you might be able to tell from the slightly tanned complexion, although looking at it, not all that much if I'm honest, I have just been away for a couple of weeks, including 5 days in sunny Rome, and it was very warm out there actually. I think 37 degrees it was over the weekend. Went over there with the missus, did all the usual, tourist sightseeing things that you have to do in Rome, the Colosseum, the Vatican, Trevi Fountain, and a video games museum as well, which you probably won't find in most of the guidebooks if I'm honest. Although we kind of stumbled across it randomly. It was like our second to last day there, walking through central Rome, and spotted a flyer for this place called VIGAMUS, the Video Games Museum of Rome. And, kind of convinced the missus a bit, said, pop in there for an hour, I'll buy you a nice dinner straight after. So she was up for it. We went in, had a little look around, and if you're ever in Rome, I'd highly recommend a visit to this place. It's only about 3 stops on the metro from Termini, the central train station, and it's about €8 each to get in. And it's actually located in the basement of this building. Not the biggest display I've ever seen. I mean, there's about 5 rooms in there, but it is all, quite packed in, and there is quite a lot to see. You'll easily spend an hour or two in there, maybe longer if you want to try out a few of the games they've got set up ready to play in there. So it kind of covers, I'll show you a bit more in detail in a moment, some of the footage that I took from there, but it kind of covers the history of home consoles, and there's a bit about computers in there as well. There are some arcade machines at your entry ticket price includes, they're all free to play when you get in. You can try out the Oculus Rift, the new version of it, which I've got to say, I tried out the first Oculus Rift last year in Manchester. The second one just blows its socks off. Really impressed with that. And also, one of the more interesting things I saw in there, they've actually got some artifacts from the buried Atari landfill from New Mexico, like the E.T. cartridges and all that. They've got a nice little display showing off some of those, which, I'll be honest, was probably the last thing I expected to see on a trip to Rome, stuff from the mythical Atari landfill. But I did take my phone out and did a little bit of filming, so I'm just going to show you a little look around the Video Games Museum of Rome. I'll include links to their website in the video description if you want to find out more and get the address and everything. But here you go, enjoy. So this is what you see first of all from the street, the sign outside. And I did mention that it's actually set in the basement of a building, so you walk down these steps. And the first thing you see is a Doom cabinet featuring some of the old 5¼ inch discs from ID Software, the original shareware version there for the PC. And then kind of continuing the adventure theme, we've got a cabinet here with some Commodore 64 versions of the old text adventure from Infocom, Zork, and a few other titles from them as well. And you couldn't really have an adventure game section without Monkey Island in there, and a few other LucasArts and assorted titles in this cabinet here. And this next one's a bit of a random collection of stuff actually. You've got some Nintendo failures, I guess you could say, the Virtual Boy and the Power Glove at the top there. A few games in the middle, and then a Vextrex console at the bottom. This cabinet here is dedicated to British systems, mainly Sinclair, but there is an Amstrad CPC 464 in there too. And then we've got a cabinet for Commodore 8-bit machines, including a signed VIC-20. A lot of stuff in the museum is actually signed, which, is very, very cool. And then there's a Commodore 64, a C16, and the quite rare Commodore 64 game system that was only released in Britain. And I remember my local Tandy selling those off for about 15 quid back in the early 90s. I so should have bought one. They sell for about £500 these days. We've got some of Sega's consoles in here, starting with the Master System 1 and 2, then the Mega Drive, Sega Saturn, Game Gear, and the Dreamcast at the bottom there too. A couple of Commodore systems, a 128 there with the VIC-20 disk drive next to it, and a couple of Atari machines that seem to have infiltrated this cabinet at the bottom. And next to it, a bit too close for comfort to the ST, is an Amiga 500 with some well-chosen games around it actually. Secret of Monkey Island, Lemmings 2, Cannon Fodder at the top there as well. All very well preserved, there's no yellowing on the systems and the boxes are in great condition. This one's more about the Sony PlayStation. We've got a PSP development tool there. And then a PS1, PS2 and PS3 underneath. They only go up to the 7th generation of consoles, not the recent gen, it is a history museum after all. A few classic consoles, a Fairchild, a Heavy Sixer Atari VCS there, 2600, a 5200 there, a 7800, and Atari's last ever system, the Jaguar with Cybermorph, Where Did You Learn to Fly? This is really cool, this cabinet actually. It's got some Pac-Man spin-offs and merchandise in there, and all the various ports to many different systems over the years. It's amazing to actually look at just how much Pac-Man merchandise there has been over the years, including this. This is a bit wacky. A Pac-Man clone board game from 1981. A couple of handhelds and weird looking stuff in this cabinet. And here we've got an Xbox display. You couldn't really have an original Xbox without the Halo series being next to it. And there's a 360 in there as well. It's still weird to think that's in a museum. A Nintendo cabinet with the original NES and Famicom, SNES, 64 there, a couple of GameCubes and a Wii. And this is my favourite bit of the museum, these infamous Atari video game cartridges that they buried in the New Mexico desert back in the video games crash of 1983. They couldn't sell them, so they took them to a landfill, and it was an urban legend that they'd done this for about 30 years, until Microsoft, Major Nelson and the team, actually went there for a documentary and dug them up last year. So as you can see, there is a certificate of authenticity there. Love that display with the little E.T. figure. And it seemed that Atari were just, burying anything they couldn't get rid of, really. There was a 2600 joystick there. Some other games like Defender. I remember when I first read about Atari burying these in the landfill, probably back in the early 90s when I first heard about it. I wasn't sure if I believed it, but I never ever thought that I'd get to see it in person. A part of video game history like this, particularly in a museum in Rome. I must admit that was the last thing I expected to see on my trip to Italy, but yeah, way cool. I love the way they put some of the soil around it as well, and they kind of explain the story on the wall here. Feel free to pause the video if you'd like to read any of it. And spinning off from the Atari section, we've got some Activision titles here, some of the early 8-bit titles that I'm sure you'll be familiar with. And a few early handhelds here as well, Telstar Coleco. That rather cool looking Tiger robot there. This bit was really interesting, a Nintendo handheld section. I didn't realise just how many handhelds Nintendo made over the years. Even all these different variations on the Game Boy. That is crazy. I had one of those at the end there with Tetris back in the early 90s. And the printer. And there's a few more down here as well. The Game Boy Advance leading off to the early DS systems. And they have lots of systems set up that you can play on, including some of them on very nice CRT screens as well. And a projector. Lovely screen on the N64 there with Super Mario 64 that I couldn't resist a quick game on. Not that I've ever been very good at that game, admittedly. A few of them are weird decisions though, like this weird Mega Drive kind of clone that was, cheap and nasty thing that was sold later on. And in the Atari section, they actually run it on PCs, running emulation with Xbox 360 controllers, which I thought was a bit odd, really. I'm not sure why they didn't just put original Atari 2600s in there. They've got a few arcade machines. There's my girlfriend having a go on Street Fighter. I had to have a go on Hang On, one of my favourites from when I was a kid at the seaside, and this is actually an original machine. It's got an ashtray on there, a Space Invaders new cabinet there. I don't think that's an original, with a display there all about the Space Invaders arcade machine. A few more arcades around the room. And there are also some PCs and recent consoles set up for local area network gaming that, are all free to play on after you've paid your entry fee. A section here dedicated to Assassin's Creed. With some very cool figures. And this bit was amazing actually, the Oculus Rift room. Now they've got a room dedicated to the Oculus Rift if you want to try out the virtual reality machine. Unfortunately, I had a go in it, it was really good, but my girlfriend Samantha was too busy playing on Wreck-It Ralph to film me at the time. But yeah, I was very impressed with the second version of it. Mario on the Atari. Is that sacrilege? And a few other classic Nintendo titles in here as well. And 8-bit Mario games. This was really good. Dino Dini's original BBC Micro that he developed, Kick-Off, the football game on back in 1982. He donated it to the museum. Apparently that is the actual machine that he coded the first Kick-Off game on. And there's a signed copy of it there. The popular section looked really good, and there is some really good displays of different games, and all around the museum on the walls there is lots of various art. So as you can see there, we've got obviously some famous developers of titles that you see in all the cabinets, and there is lots of concept art of games, and kind of you can look through and see the development of characters that you'll be familiar with, which is actually quite interesting to see, where they started from and what the characters ended up looking like in the end. And that's about it really. I mentioned, it's not a massive place, but there is quite a lot to see. You can easily spend an hour or two in here. And that's been a look around the VIGAMUS Video Games Museum. If you're ever in Rome, definitely recommend a visit to this place. I'll leave a link to their website and a bit more info in the video description. I will catch you in the next vid.